Namaskaram. Swamiji, Namaskaram. I am very happy to be here today on this auspicious occasion, and I offer congratulations again for the wonderful translation of Ramanujar and all those who worked on making it possible. So there were two or three important conferences in 2017 and 2018 marking the millennial celebration of Ramanuja. And I think it's wonderful that in 2023 we have yet another conference reminding us that 1,000 years needs to be celebrated over and over again. And as Professor said at the beginning, so many distinguished scholars will be presenting their work today and tomorrow, showing us that there is always more to be said about Sri Ramanuja, about his heritage, the philosophy, the practice, the devotion. And we are all happy to be part of this today. Sri Venkateshan, in his learned comments opening, have shown us so many dimensions of who Ramanuja is, as an intellectual, as a reformer, and as a man of personal devotion. And I think we can be grateful. And Professor Panneerselvam, in his very learned opening address, I think has reminded us of the scholars who have gone before. You mentioned kindly John Carman, who is a good friend of mine. He is very senior now, but nonetheless I think is in good health still. And before him, Professor Van Buitenen, Hans van Buitenen of the University of Chicago, who did some of the first translations in the West of the Vedanta Sangraha, Gita Bhashya, and so on like that. He was a great Ramanuja scholar. And there are others I could mention. Vasudha Narayanan at the University of Florida, Srilata Raman, University of Toronto, Sucharita Adluri in Cleveland, and the Catholic scholars Julius Lipner, who has written extensively on Ramanuja, and the Dominican Father Martin Ganeri, who has written a brilliant book on Thomas Aquinas and Ramanuja. We could go on, and then we realize, those of us in the West reading mainly in English, of all the wonderful writing that's being done in Tamil about Sri Ramanuja. To tell you the truth, we can barely keep up, but we're very glad to see that the scholarship continues to grow. So back at the 2017 conferences, when I was invited to give my paper, I wanted to do something that had not been done before. And so around 2016, in that time period, I began to read the Nitya Grantham. This was the one work of Ramanuja that I knew less about. And I found that there was really no good English translation of the work. Scholars like Marian Rastelli in Vienna had done some scholarship. But I took it upon myself, as best I could, to do a translation of the Nitya Grantham. And that began to open up for me a way of learning about Ramanuja that I think will be obvious to most of you, but for me, coming from the West, a helpful understanding. My translation was published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies in 2018 or 19, and I think has made its way around in India as well. And it was an honor for me to do this translation. The simple point that I would like to make in my address here, that I think is known very well to most of you, all of you already, is that we need to honor Ramanuja, as Mr. Venkateshan said in his opening address, the whole of Ramanuja. Not simply the Bhashyakara, although that's so important, not simply the reformer, though that's so important, not so only the Bhakta or Prapanna, although that's so important, but the entire understanding of this great intellectual figure. How do we learn from him as a complete person? And for me, a simple way of getting at this, and again, I apologize that it may be so obvious to most of you, is to think of the 9 works that he wrote. Not simply 3 works, not simply Vedanta Sangraha, Gita Bhashya, Sri Bhashya, or adding in the Sara and the Deepa, but 9 works. And we appreciate, of course, the fact that the Gadya Traya and then the Nitya Grantham are also works that have been attributed to Sri Ramanuja for a very long time. And I think one of the lacks of Western scholarship which has often been very good, is not paying much attention to these later devotional works. And the simple point of my paper that will appear in the book, that is coming out shortly, very shortly I guess, is simply to say that if we read all 9 works, this enriches and changes how we read any of the 9 works. It sounds like a simple point, but I think this is an important idea for us in the West to understand. There had been some controversy back in the 1960s. I think some of you have read about this or read the relevant articles, arguing that perhaps the true Ramanuja, the true scholar, is the Bhashyakara. Vedartha Sangraha, Sri Bhashya, Gita Bhashya, the Sara and the Deepa, and that the other works were possibly written by some disciple of Ramanuja and came later on. And several serious scholars, including Robert Lester, tried to explain this and tried to put forward the reasons. They were not anti-Ramanuja. They were not against the Sampradaya or against the memory of Ramanuja, but they were simply saying that these works seem to be different. And if you look at them as different, you could say these works are by Ramanuja, and these works are probably by his disciple. And while I think there's certainly something to think about there, my own reading and my own understanding is that taking the 9 works together is much more influential and important. Why? Because if we begin to read with the Nityagrantham and see the daily practice of the Prapanna, the person who has already presented himself, herself in Sharanagati, if we see that person, and if we see the beautiful prayers that come in the 3 Gadyas, then we can begin to understand why Ramanuja bothered to write the Vedartha Sangraha, the Sri Bhashya, the Gita Bhashya. That it's important to understand what is the spiritual, devotional, practical motivation behind those works. Again, I'm sorry, this is obvious, I think, to most of you. So in my paper for the volume that is forthcoming, Ramanuja's commentarial works in light of the Nityam and the Gadyas, I take up 3 examples of what I mean. And my time is limited, so I will not go through them in any detail, and everyone can read the volume when it comes out, all the papers. But that meditation has a positive content, and that's why saguna is important. Meditation is to be repeated throughout one's life. That is why karma does not go away in the life of the prapanna. And thirdly, even when one acts for one's entire life, the action is simply the work of the Lord and not of the self. And all of these 3 points, on the content of meditation, on the repetition of meditation until the day of one's death, and the idea that the Lord alone is an agent of all action, are very clear in the devotional works, and then are defended in the Vedartha Sangraha, Sri Bhashya, Gita Bhashya. And I'll give you simply some examples before coming to my conclusion. So the idea that the meditation has a positive content, this again is well known, but so often in the Gadyas and in the Nityagrantham, Sri Ramanuja visualizes the beauty of the Lord. Here is a passage in my translation from the Nityagrantham. The Lord seated on the coils of the serpent, Narayana, his eyes elongated and pure, the petals of a lotus, adorned with all his adornments, the crowns, the bracelets, the necklace of pearls, his right leg slightly bent, his left leg forward, his right arm forward and resting on his knee, his left arm resting on the coils of the serpent, holding the Kanchan wheel by 2 upper arms. This is the one who is the cause of the universe, the creation, preservation, destruction of all. He is beautifully dark in appearance. He is shining with the Kaustubha gem. His body comprised of the 5 powers, the highest inconceivable and unprecedented sattva, shining, awake, tall, manifest. And the devotee in the course of Nitya Puja every day is invited to close their eyes and to visualize the Lord as so beautiful. We know this. What is striking is that some of the same descriptions, not exactly the same, but same, show up in Vedartha Sangraha and even in the Sri Bhashya. Here's from the Vedartha Sangraha, a visualization of the Lord. The Lord is always gloriously visible. He is the preeminent person who dwells within the orb of the sun. His splendor is like that of a colossal mountain of molten gold. His brilliance like that of the rays of hundreds of thousands of suns. His long, slender eyes are spotless, like the petals of a lotus, which sprouting forth from deep water on a soft stalk, blossoms in the rays of the sun. His eyes and his forehead and his nose are beautiful. His coral-like lips smile graciously. His soft cheeks are beaming. His neck is delicately shaped as a conch shell, his bud-like divine ears, beautifully formed, hanging down toward his shoulders, and on and on. And I think what's interesting in a passage like that is in the Gadya and in the Nitya Grantham, Ramanuja is saying, visualize, see the beauty of the Lord. Then in the Vedartha Sangraha, following the passage, preceding the passage I just gave, he is making rational arguments why we need to take seriously that this is the way the Lord looks. He uses pramanas, he appeals to the Veda, appeals to the Upanishad, appeals to the Vishnu Purana, and on, showing that there is no reason to hold that the Lord is only nirguna, and that having meditations on the beauty of the Lord is part and parcel of what our tradition is about, he's saying. And therefore the arguments are not simply abstract arguments, one professor fighting with another professor, but what we find in Vedartha Sangraha is defending the daily practice and the daily meditation. Second point, the value of practice and practices that go on lifelong. So there is no point in the life of the devotee, as far as I understand, you would know better than I, in which one stops one's ritual practice, one's daily devotion, and says, I am beyond action. Rather, every day this continues. In the Sharanagati Gadyam, for instance, Ramanuja says, may my taking refuge at the lotus feet of the Lord be continuous and according to every condition, perform for the highest goal, with a desire to achieve perpetual service, Nitya Kaimkarya, which has the form of delight solely in existing for his sake, suited to every condition without exception, made to occur to a flawless excess of pleasure born of experiencing him all the days of one's life. Again from the Gadya, you shall become a person of perpetual service, which has the form of delight solely in existing for my sake, in experiencing me every day. Again in the Gadya, you shall be a person of perpetual service, serving me every day throughout your life. And again, these passages talk about in a very simple way the need for the devotion to continue throughout one's life. But then we see in the Sri Bhashya, that most important of the works of Sri Ramanuja, defenses of what he just said in a more devotional fashion. So here's a passage from later on earlier in the Sri Bhashya, that sacrifices and so on are the means of meditation. The steady remembrance of his form will be declared later on. But although sacrifices and the like are enjoyed with a view to the origination of knowledge, as it says in Brihadaranyaka, they desire to know, it is only knowledge in the form of meditation, which being practiced day after day, constantly improved by repetition and continued up to death, is the means of reaching Brahman. Hence, all the works connected with the different conditions of life are to be performed throughout life, only for the purpose of originating and purifying such knowledge. So he's saying here in Sri Bhashya what he was saying in the Gadya. But again, the difference is, he's saying it in the Gadya inviting everyone into the practice. But in the Sri Bhashya, as I read it, he's now defending it philosophically, intellectually, theologically, using pramanas to say that this is not only beautiful and devotional, but this is intellectually correct as well. And if you understand what's going on in the Nityam and in the Gadyas, you can understand why Ramanuja bothers to make these points in the Bhashyas. Simple point. And finally, the third one, and I could give many more quotes, having said that everything is a matter of continuing to act all the days of your life, continuing to form the Nitya Puja, continuing to enact the beautiful ritual given in Nitya Grantham. Ramanuja is also clear, but you are not really the agent of your own actions. You are simply the instrument of the Lord. So in a sense, he's having it both ways. On the one hand, we must act. We must do what we can each day. On the other hand, we do nothing. Because for the person who has surrendered to the Lord, everything comes from the Lord. So in the Nityam, he says, the person should meditate. The Lord alone, by way of me, who belongs entirely to him, begins to please his own self, along with his retinue and paraphernalia, by his own auspicious and honorable enjoyments, tangible, related to food, etc. So you're sitting there performing, and you're thinking, it is the Lord alone who is pleasing himself by this action. The Lord is the object of the meditation. The Lord is the subject of the meditation. The Lord is the doer of the meditation. And I am simply the instrument of the Lord. Or again, he says later on in the Nityam, the Lord alone, by way of me, who belongs to him, pleases his own self by all these auspicious enjoyments and ways of acting. Same point being made. And again, then he says in his interpretations of the Brahma Sutras, the Gita, and so on, he makes the same points intellectually. So for instance, in Gita Bhashya, chapter 3, Krishna says, Ramanuja paraphrases Krishna, therefore, by meditation on his own proper nature, as instigated by me, Krishna, as being my body, the body of Krishna, having renounced all work unto me, the Supreme Person, thinking that it is by me that all the works are done, by the Lord and not the self, performing such actions purely as acts of worship, without desire for any fruits, because the fruits go to the performer, which is the Lord, not me, free from selfishness, the fear of action, fear of stopping action is gone. Or in the same section of Gita Bhashya, contemplating that the Lord of all, the principle and beginning of all things, causes these works to be done by the infinite, by the finite self as agent, who belongs entirely to the Lord. Such action is solely for the purpose of the worship of the Lord by the actions given over for a moment to the agent. Liberated from the fever of death, namely, what will become of me because of the heaping up of sins brought on by being in time, remembering that it is only the Supreme Person who, having been worshipped, will cause you to be liberated from bondage, do the yoga of works. So brilliantly using the teaching of karma yoga in the Gita to explain what is already being said and practiced daily according to the Nitya Grantham. So my paper at great length, which is in the book, goes on making these points. And therefore, to conclude my small address here, if we begin, and again, this is known to you 100% at least, but for us who are scholars in the West, to realize that Ramanuja is, as was said so beautifully by both our speakers, a man of practice, a man of devotion, a man who is acting out his faith right from the beginning. If you start with that truth, then you can understand better Ramanuja the scholar, Ramanuja the Acharya, Ramanuja, we might say today, the professor, and so on. But if we don't start with the Gadyas and the Nityam, we may come to them and say, well, these are not important. These are secondary works, and we'll just talk about Vedartha Sangraha, Sri Bhashya, Gita Bhashya, which some people do. So I think the point is turning things around and beginning with the practice, and then the intellectual works matter all the more. I think we could also go further. I'll just make a footnote on this. Mr. Venkatesan was using some of the itihasas that come up in the Bhagavad Vijayan, where Sri Ramanuja prostrates himself in the dust, or he's reading a certain text and the tears fall from his eyes. We could go further and also bring those texts in and say, why did he write the Nityagrantham? Why did he compose the Gadyas? Because he was already involved in the Divya Prabandham. He was already a devotional figure within the community. So then you could begin with the Divya Prabandham, and then the Gadyas and the Nityagrantham, and then read the Bhashyas and Vedartha Sangraha. So it all can spell out very beautifully. But my last point would be to say, 2017 was the millennium as we have celebrated for Sri Ramanuja. It is now 2023. So we are already 6 years into the new millennium. We're already beginning another 1,000 years. And I think we realize, first of all, much more is to be written, understood, both in English, in Sanskrit, in Tamil, in other languages, about the heritage of Ramanuja. The beautiful drama Ramanujar also, I think, is a contribution of imagining Ramanuja, his life, his work, his story, putting it on the stage, doing so in other media. There are so many more things to be done, because the promise of saying he was a reformer and that his mission, his grace, is relevant in the 21st century is easy to say, but to bring it to a wide group of people to understand Ramanuja and his contribution, more needs to be done by papers such as we hear today and tomorrow. But I think it also helps us to understand other thinkers as well. So to understand Sri Shankara, Sri Madhva, other reformers before and after, these were not simply intellectuals writing philosophical books, but they were also men and women of action, men and women of devotion, men and women of meditation. And to show this with every great thinker of Indian tradition, that the practice and the devotion are also important, also has to be done. And then finally, I think it's a good note that some of us here are professors teaching in universities or have spent lives teaching in universities, that it's important for us also to ask ourselves if Sri Ramanuja and such figures have devotional practice, have lives of self-surrender to the Lord, and then do their intellectual work, then what does it mean for people like the professors, like me, to have intellectual work and write books, give speeches and so on, but also have a personal spiritual life? And that for all of us, including the professors, to go back and forth between the intellectual world and the spiritual world. And to not be afraid in academic settings to say, I too am a practitioner. I too am a believer. I too am a person of faith, because great teachers like Ramanuja teach us, always keep your faith and what you think together, your heart and what you write, keep it all together. This is a lesson all of us need to learn in 21st century. So I'll stop there because we have many wonderful papers coming today and tomorrow. And again, I express my gratitude to Swamiji for inviting me to be here. Thank you.
Narayana, I just want to say something. One is that Father Clooney, I'll use Father because I believe that Father is higher than being Professor. So only some people are called to be priests, but anybody can be a professor, if the professors don't mind me saying that. So you gave a talk which was totally different, which is also influenced by what you said, you are a man of faith. So because of that you are able to emphasize a point which is not really understood. Many philosophers like Professor Panniselvam understand the importance of an inner life, and that we should also understand the teachings which are there in the Indian philosophy. And that I've heard professors talking about another professor that she is mixing up praxis with the theory. Only theory should be there. She's imposing her practices on that. So all these things are, I think, very silly, because the purpose of all this philosophy is to transform the person, to change the person. So that is why Sri Ramanuja did all the great bhashyas and all that he wrote, was to give the correct, what he considered the correct approach to the upasanas, the teachings also which were there in the Upanishads, in the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita, and how that could be practiced also. Another point also which you made is about his original works and the texts. So, as a boy, I hated reading the Shankara Bhashya, especially in the afternoon. Especially in the afternoon, because I would go to sleep. But his original works, it's only much later that I was able to, after reading the Upanishads many times, I was able to go to Shankara Bhashya and enjoy it. But his original prakarnas like Viveka Chudamani and Prabodha Sudhakara and others, they were very enjoyable reading because he is talking to a sadhaka and how you can practice this. So the first 50 verses of Viveka Chudamani are enough to take us to moksha. We don't have to go through the rest. So there the style is different, there the intent is different. He is not proving any point. He is talking to you because you are already a seeker and you are already convinced of that fact. So the same thing we can see in the Gadyas, we can see in the Nitya also. He is assuming that you know, you understood, you accepted, and now you want to walk the path. So there's a difference between that and the difference between the Bhashyas, because there he has to prove his point, he has to prove that his Siddhanta is in accordance with the Vedas, in accordance, he has to. So there he is circumscribed by the text. That he has to, within the framework of the text, he has to write. Same thing you can see in Shankara Bhashya also. But in the original works, the creativity comes out like that. And it's so very enjoyable. Narayana, Narayana. Thank you very much, Father. And we must hear you more often. Maybe you could, if you're not in India, you should come on Zoom. Narayana.
And Swami Sri Hari Prasad Ji for sharing their invaluable wisdom and making this event an intellectually stimulating and enriching experience. It is my privilege to call upon Sri T.K. Santanakrishnan to honor Professor Clooney, Sri Venkatesan and Dr. Paneer Selvam.